All right. Good evening, and gentlemen, and welcome to the June 3rd meeting of the City of Vista Planning Commission. Let's rise and do the pledge, led by Commissioner Bell.
Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Chair Rossler, let the record reflect that all commissioners are present with the exception of the two student commissioners.
Ms. Chow, has their term come to an end? It has. Okay. All right. Very good. Commissioners, next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from May 21st. Are there any changes? And if not, can I hear a motion to approve them? Commissioner Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If none of the other commissioners have any changes, I move that we accept the changes, accept the minutes as presented.
Commissioner Garrettson.
I would second that motion.
All right. It's been moved and second to approve the minutes of May 21st. Please cast your vote. And the minutes pass with Commissioner Rossler abstaining because he wasn't here. So, Ms. Chow, any changes to the agenda?
No changes tonight. Thank you.
All right. The next item on our agenda is oral communications. This is a time that the Planning Commission sets aside for citizens to address the Commission on any items that are not on the agenda. I don't have any speakers slips. Anyone wishing to address the Commission? All right, moving on then to our public hearings. Our first public hearing is a proposed amendment to the Development Code for accessory dwelling units. Mr. Conley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tonight we'll be talking about accessory dwelling units. First of all, I wanted to cover terminology real quickly. We currently refer to accessory units as second units in our development code. The state law refers to them as accessory dwelling units, as do most jurisdictions that review these. So one of the proposed changes is to rephrase our chapter to call it accessory dwelling units and get rid of the second unit terminology to avoid any confusion. But an accessory dwelling unit, also known as an ADU, come in really three forms in our code. A detached unit is separated from the main structure. An attached unit is attached to the primary structure, or a repurposed existing space unit, which is basically unit within existing space of the home that's repurposed for the purpose of an ADU. An ADU is a dwelling with complete independent living facilities, including a kitchen that can accommodate one or more persons. A second unit and a granny flat are what some other jurisdictions use as terminology. We're eliminating those, or those aren't included in our code, but just for clarification, what some other jurisdictions use that we will not be using. One term that we do use, though, is a guest house. A guest house is bedrooms and bathrooms separate from the main unit with no kitchen. It's just bedrooms and bathrooms that would serve guests of your home. They are allowed in the same single-family residential zones as accessory units. But they do not allow a kitchen, and they're limited in size to 700 square feet, and that is a permissible use in all the single-family zones. The City Council discussed accessory dwelling units at the request of Councilman Green on February 26th of this year. The staff was directed to return for formal direction related to the zoning codes and development impact fees that are applicable to these units. On April 9th, we revisited it with the City Council, and they gave us specific direction to change the maximum unit size, as well as to allow some waivers for development impact fees, which is the purpose of our amendment. Currently, the maximum unit size for an ADU is based on the zoning designation and the lot size. First of all, an accessory dwelling unit may not exceed the size of the primary residence. We do not intend to change that. That's in accordance with state law as well. Under our current zoning, it could be up to 1,000 square feet if it's greater than 1 acre lot in the E1, A1, or OR zones. The E1 is half-acre minimum. The A1 is 1 acre minimum. The OR is 2.5 acre minimum. In the next category is 800 square feet for a detached ADU on lots that are less than 1 acre. In the R1, E1, A1, and OR zones, the R1 is 10,000 square feet. So the zones that allow them now that are not proposed to change are R1, which is 10,000, E1, which is half acre, A1, which is 1 acre, and OR, which is 2.5 acre. For all other conditions, in any attached ADUs at 650 square feet. The state permits a maximum size of 1,200 square feet for ADUs, and so the City Council's direction was to amend Chapter 1831 to allow a maximum unit size of 1,200 square feet in all permissible zones if it's a detached unit. As I mentioned before, an ADU may still not exceed the size of the primary residence, but it could go up to 1,200 if it was detached and met all of the applicable setbacks and other development standards. In the attached condition, it would be limited to 50% of the size of the main unit or 1,200 square feet, whichever is less. With respect to development impact fees, these units right now typically require the 4 fees that are shown there for fire, parks, traffic, and public facilities. The fees shown are what the current fees are. Some of these go up on an annual basis. Some of them are fixed. But the total fees for an accessory dwelling unit under the current condition is about $14,700. That assumes about a 1,000 square foot ADU. This is a fee breakdown that shows the differences between what the development impact fees are, which are in red, and the staff time or plan review fees, which are in yellow. The proposal is to waive the $14,700 fees that are development impact fees, but maintain the fees that would be required for plan check and inspection, which run about $3,700, again, based on about a 1,000 square foot accessory dwelling unit. The City Council's direction is to amend the development code to waive development impact fees for affordable units. An affordable unit would require a 5-year covenant that would allow the unit to count towards Vista's regional housing needs assessment or our affordable housing requirements that are imposed by the state. An affordable household is defined as 80% of the annual median income in the county based on the size of household. And right now, the annual median income in San Diego County is about $83,000. So for a family of 1, it would be around $60,000. For a family of 4, it would be around $65,000, if I'm not mistaken. I have a chart here if you want to get into the real specifics. But if someone qualifies as an affordable household and they want to put an ADU, or they want to rent an ADU, they're building an ADU for an affordable household, they would have to record a 5-year deed restriction that shows that that house would be rented to someone that qualifies as an affordable income. That would be handled through our housing department, which is run through the city manager's office. There's a form that each owner would have to fill out to show that their renter would qualify, and they would do that on an annual basis. And so that's how those units would be handled. It would only apply for a 5-year period, after which it could go back to whatever rate the owner would want to charge. The State Department of Housing and Community Development does not require any type of a deed restriction in order to count an accessory unit as an affordable unit, but the city does have to have some evidence of the fact that we are requiring it be rented to an affordable household, and so the 5-year deed restriction is how we intend to do that. A caregiver may also qualify under this exemption as long as there's appropriate medical documentation to show that the person being cared for is either living in the ADU and being cared for by the primary residence, or vice versa, living in the primary residence and being cared for by the person that's in the ADU. And again, medical documentation would be provided to our housing department to determine that eligibility, which would allow for the waiver of development impact fees. The full fees that I mentioned before, the $14,000 and change, would still apply for any units that did not qualify as affordable or did not rent to a caregiver or a person receiving care. But if they did qualify, the fee waiver would be recognized. And finally, the council's direction was to allow this for a 5-year trial period, or for the first 100 ADUs that are permitted from the date of approval. And so this will have to move forward to the City Council for their consideration, If it's approved later this month, it would go into effect in July, and from that date forward, we'd be counting the ones that would receive waivers or within that 5-year period, after which we would revisit it with the council to see if they wanted to continue it. And so that completes my staff report, and I am available for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Conley? Commissioner Kramer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Conley, concern with the attached ADUs, can I convert my garage?
Yes, you can.
Really?
The state says that you are permitted to convert your garage as existing space, and you do not have to provide additional parking to do that. That's state law. So we don't have any choice in that matter.
I don't care for that.
I think there's a lot of jurisdictions that feel the same, but that is what the state
Yeah.
requires.
That was a shock. I was surprised when he told me that also. So,
I'm not done.
are you not? I'm
I got
sorry.
some more.
Go
The ADUs will require a deed change, correct?
So a restriction would be recorded against your deed, which would be for a 5-year period that would identify that it's an affordable unit and has to be rented at the affordable levels for that 5-year period.
Okay, so what if it is not, it doesn't qualify for an affordable, if someone just wants to build a granny flat or whatever? That's still a deed change?
There's no deed change in that regard. They just have to pay the full development impact fees.
Okay, so they have to pay the $14,000, but they get the benefit of their property value just increased because they have a built-in rental, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Next question, sewer fees. So we all pay sewer fees. Is there a separate sewer fee for the new ADU, or does the primary household, does the sewer fees are increased because now you could have another family live in there? How is that going to work?
So there are 2 sewer fees that apply. One is the connection fee, which pays for the actual connection for a new unit, and then there's annual fees that pay for service. The state's legislation in 2017 eliminated the connection fee for ADUs, so we can't charge that, but we can charge the annual fee for sewer service. So that's the way it applies.
Okay, so if you're currently paying $650, then you would be paying $1,300?
Correct.
Okay. That's all I have right now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Commissioner Garrettson.
Yes, Mr. Conley, if you looked at a map of the entire city, what percentage of the city would be eligible for this ADU? For instance, I printed a map of R1B, and for instance, R1B in the Shadow Ridge area, you have certain exemptions like the Shadow Ridge specific plan, correct?
Yes, so the R1B zone is not currently a zone that allows ADUs, and the majority of the Shadow Ridge area is in a specific plan with lot sizes that are smaller than what the ADU allowances are. So most of South Vista doesn't fit within the allowances for an ADU. The majority of these properties are located in the northeast portion of the city, and in the central portion of the city there are some R1 zone lots. It's probably somewhere around, I'd guess about 40% of our residentially zoned properties are zones that would allow it.
And that's primarily central and northeastern city.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Grimm.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I was clear on something. So take one of those sites, for example, one of the lots in the northeast part of the city. If you had, say, a 2,400 square foot home on the site, you can fit another one on that's up to 1,200 square feet. And then that can also have a garage that doesn't count toward that square footage, right?
That's correct.
So you can have basically a 1,600 square foot home on a lot that already has, say, a 2,400 square foot home, essentially making it an R2, basically, in an R1 zone. Not quite, but kind of doing that.
You could. we only require one parking space for an accessory dwelling unit, and it doesn't require a garage. So someone could build that on their own volition, but it wouldn't typically be counted toward the size of the ADU. It's separate. So yes, you could have a 2,400 square foot home, a 1,200 square foot ADU, and a 400 square foot garage all on the same property.
And then the other part of that question is, okay, let's say someone does that, how is enforcement going to work? Is somebody going to check every year to make sure that somebody that's in there meets affordable?
If it's affordable? Yeah. If it meets the affordable.
If it meets the affordable, in other words, it's part of the affordable system. Because you could see somebody starting to do that, have somebody come in, and then after a year, to me, it seems like it would be very hard to enforce that.
Yes, so our housing department enforces that on an annual basis. They qualify the renter to make sure that they meet the affordability requirements. There's a form that the owner has to fill out during the term of the 5-year deed restriction every year.
So there is a review of who these affordable tenants are going to be.
Correct. Our housing division performs that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Commissioner Looney.
John, I did the same thing on the medium income, and you had a much higher figure than what I found. I found 63,400 for the medium income for San Diego County.
San Diego County you use the county in which you're located in to determine it. And I printed it today, actually. 2019 annual area median income for San Diego County is 86,300. So at 80% for a one-person household, that would be 59,950. A two-person would be 68,500. A three-person would be 77,050. A four-person would be 85,600.
Does the city have a maximum lot coverage that this might apply to, or are the ADUs exempt from lot coverage? I know.
In the zones that are affected, in other words, R1, E1, A1, OR, no. In the R1B zone, yes, we start getting into lot coverage standards at 60%, but for these, it's simply setback requirements that would apply. So they have to meet the main building setbacks, which in most cases are 10 on the side, 20 in the front, 10 to 20 in the rear, depending on the size of the structure.
The county just changed their regulations March 29th, where they used to have a 5-foot setback for any ADU, and I guess they had a lot of complaints from adjacent property owners, so now any ADU has to adhere to any standard building setback. Encinitas makes a modification to the lot coverage by 10%. So there's a wide spectrum of policy through each city.
So remember that, well, if it's an existing accessory structure, it could be as close as 5 feet, and you could amend that or modify that to create the ADU. In those situations where it's an existing permitted structure, we have to allow it, but if it's a new ADU, it has to meet the main building setbacks. Also, this is the Planning Commission's recommendation to the City Council, so if you wanted to identify a desire to include a lot coverage standard or something along those lines, it could be included in this recommendation that's going to the council later this month.
Okay, just a question, because I deal with it often. I've got an existing detached garage 5 feet from a property line, and I want to build an ADU on top of that. In some jurisdictions, that ADU has to adhere to current building setbacks. What policy will the city of Vista be taking? Can we put an ADU on top of that garage even though it encroaches within the standard building setbacks?
You would be able to put it inside the existing garage at the 5 foot, but if you put it on top of the garage, you'd have to meet the main building setbacks.
And also in the write-up, I thought I remember seeing that at the end of 5 years, City Council has an opportunity to reevaluate that 5-year
Allowance.
loan. Yeah.
Yes, so that was the direction, was to allow it for 5 years, and then they would like to revisit that policy to see how it's working at the end of that 5-year period, or the first 100 ADUs if it's more than that within the 5 years.
Okay. Thank you, John.
Commissioner Grimm? You good? I'm good. Okay. Commissioner Kramer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Conley, I'm sorry, did you say that we are going to limit it to 180 units or?
So the council direction was to allow this waiver of development impact fees for affordable units for 5 years or 100 ADUs, whichever comes first.
Okay. So the 101 person who comes for an ADU's got to pay the whole enchilada.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Conley.
Commissioner Garrettson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Conley, how much of this is mandated and how much of it is optional? In other words, are these ADUs going to be mandated by law?
When you say how much of this, meaning how much of the
How
proposed
much of the
changes?
ADU?
A lot of
that-
it is mandated by the state. You have to allow it. You have to allow it in most single-family zones. You have to limit it to one parking space, except in certain circumstances. I mean, there's a whole handout that the Housing and Community Development Department has that details what the state's requirements are. We amended our ordinance 2 years ago to comply with the state requirements. The changes that are being made now are at the council's direction. They're not required.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that was on the record, that a lot of these things we have no choice, but
Commissioner
as
Bell?
Mr. Stone is looking for something now.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Connolly, question, following Commissioner Garrettson's question, the status quo right now is ADUs are allowed. Someone comes in, they go through the proper permitting application, they pay the fees that we just saw, up to $18,000, give or take. What was the policy reasoning the City Council discussion had behind offering this waiver of fees? Is there a concern that there are people who would build ADUs that aren't doing it because of this fee, and that the city has an interest in wanting those people to build to meet our affordable housing?
The council's interest, as I could best determine, was to promote another means of affordable housing. I can say with certainty that there are people that aren't building them because of the fees that apply, because
Okay.
I've had people come into the counter and tell me that, but I really believe the council's idea was to provide some affordable housing.
Okay, and then I'm sure we don't have exact numbers, but the general impression of the city and the planning department is that there are homes in Vista that, absent this $14,000, would comply with the affordable housing requirements and gladly rent to someone within that range. Is this a need that the city thinks is going to be at least somewhat met?
Yeah, I believe we'll see a fair number of applications here over the next few months from this change if it is approved. We've had a number of people come into our counter and inquire about it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. If that's all the questions, Commissioner Garrettson.
Yes, and Mr. Conley, in terms of these fees, is it the thinking of the council, as you understand it, that without these, if the fees remain, that the ADUs will not be built? That
I think that you'll still see ADUs built. I mean, we still have numerous applications coming through the department. I think you'll just see more than what we would otherwise see.
So this is basically just helping the developers?
Helping the single-family homeowners
Well,
that want to build ADUs.
Well, developers could be the homeowners too. But if they're going to be built regardless of whether they waive the fee or not, and our concern is availability of, affordable housing, it seems to me that, you don't need to do this in order to have people develop the ADUs.
So you should probably convey that to the city council.
Okay.
All right, Commissioners, this is a public hearing, and I do have a speaker slip from Mr. Kaiser. You want to come join us?
Favor the policy in general. I got confused on a couple of things. Is the affordable requirement applied to the landlord as well, or only to the renter?
Only to the renter.
Okay. And some cases they require a one-space parking, in other cases you don't? Something like within a certain range of public transportation?
Half mile.
Okay. And then 10,000 square feet is the minimum lot size in order to have a ADU? Right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kaiser. Anyone else wishing to address the commission during the public hearing? If come and speak and fill out a speaker's slip so we know who you are. You can do that after you testify, so.
Good evening. My name is Rosemary Garza. I'm a resident of Vista. What I wanted to say also that I don't see it really come up as much is the difference between an ADU to regular, I'm getting nervous, sorry.
Sorry, take a
granny
deep breath.
flats and add-ons is also the requirements for sprinkler system as well. In addition, you have to increase the meter size as far as the water department. Then you have all these impact fees as well from VID. For the irrigation or the sprinkler system, you're still looking at additional, roughly probably $5,000 to $7,000 on top of that to add on if your home doesn't currently have that. In the ADUs, from what I understand, all that would be overwritten as well. So you would have to do the additional fire sprinkler systems and then increase of your meter size and capacity fees to VID as well. So that was a concern we had. You mentioned for example, my children are coming back home because of the cost of the apartments alone. They were up here on Santa Fe in a 2-bedroom, 1-bath for almost going to $2,100 with cockroaches and constantly facing floodings in the apartments. And it's a shame because I have my grandkids being raised in this. So they've come back home. It's a tight fit, but we have the space to do it. It's just the money now we're talking about. And that's why people like myself are going back to looking at this type of programs because it is a big, you're talking about an additional $18,000 from the city of Vista, but then when you start adding the fire sprinkler system requirements and then the increase of the water size of meter to meet the requirements from the fire department and so forth, it all starts adding up. So I just wanted to bring that out. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Anyone else wish to address the commission? All right, we will close the public hearing and move to commissioner discussion. Commissioner Looney.
Yep. To add to her list of expenses, the electric meter also has to be upgraded. You can't get a separate meter for an ADU. It has to be tied into the existing house. So you can still have A and B, but it still has to come off the main.
One meter. Okay. Does that apply for gas also? Gas and electric?
I don't know.
All the utilities have to come off the main unit. There may be an electrical panel upgrade, but they do have to come from the main unit. The only caveat is that your ADU only has to be sprinklered if your main unit is sprinklered.
Okay, so if your main unit isn't sprinklered now, you don't have to do the ADU. Okay.
You don't have to do it in the ADU. That's correct.
Okay. All right. Okay. Commissioner Bell?
Just summarizing the thoughts, it seems like we're not being asked to consider the viability of ADUs at this point. I think that's pretty set in state law. There's a lot of issues I'm sure we all have with pluses and minuses of those. But just as to the issue of whether giving this fee waiver in exchange for providing more affordable housing, in a perfect world, I would love to have data on the County of San Diego, North County itself, on the amount of people above or below a certain income level that would be willing to rent. That, you know, more data would be amazing to have. On the other hand, I commend the City Council for trying something and putting something out there. I like the idea that there's a set time frame and a limit on this. I think that provides some security and to see how it goes and where it goes. I would be shocked if people who were willing to do this there was over 100 people right now that would do it just because of the $14,000 discount. I think that we've all seen there's a lot more fees involved and a lot more costs, but certainly that incentive would be great to at least lock in for the next 5 years some affordable housing advertised and spread out that's not in the form of multi-story apartment buildings in our community. So I would be in favor of this as it is, certainly with listening to other options and add-ons as people would want to touch the lot size or limitations that might be there. But otherwise, just as to the question presented here of the waiver and the affordable housing aspect, I'd be in favor of it.
Commissioner Garrettson.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I would tend to oppose this just based on the fact that these ADUs are going to be built regardless of this fee waiver. And if they're going to be built anyway, it seems to me all we're doing is taking away revenue from the city and giving it to whomever is going to be developing it. And I don't see how this is going to speed things up any. You know, the only caveat there would be the 5 years or, the 100 units might sway me. But otherwise, I don't know why the city wants to waive this fee.
Mr. Connolly, are there people that you're aware of that are waiting for this to pass to come in and apply?
Yes.
Okay. So there is a demand out there for this, and we do get affordable units out of it for the 5 years. So, Commissioner Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To piggyback in one sense off of Mr. Garrettson's question or statement was 18,100 units. That's $1.8 million gift that the city is giving away. That's a lot of money. So it is something to consider, and if we do consider it, whatever we do, I would like to at least have someone, maybe Commissioner Looney, that can speak to this better, but I like the idea of having a lot coverage statement included in this so that we don't have the potential of overcrowding on a single lot. That's all I have for right now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Commissioner Grimm?
Yeah, this one's a real conundrum. It's one of those things. If you vote against it, you feel like you're not supportive of affordable housing. And to hear the Garzas talking something, it sounds like something that would be really good for their family. The other side of that, and most of it has been mentioned, is I worry a lot about the fees, and maybe there's not going to be that many units generated. But I think staff is doing a study right now on the costs of public facilities.
We have not started that yet, but we have done recent development impact fee updates. I can say, though, that Commissioner Kramer is correct that it could equate to 1.8 or actually $1.4 million in lost fee revenue. However, considering the amount of multifamily development that we've approved in the last few years and that's going through the pipe right now, we are generating a lot more than that in development impact fees from these 50 and 100 unit projects than we get from these little 1 unit operations.
Well, the big problem, at least in my experience, is when wastewater treatment, you run out of EDUs, and at some point, you're going to have to pay the piper for that. And whether or not the other fees are going to make up for that, that's still somebody else kind of paying for this, because the costs are astronomical, as you already know, for providing, at some point when you get, whether it's wastewater or other kinds of public facilities. And, like I said, I still at this point haven't decided how I'm going to vote on this, because it is a conundrum. But those are my concerns.
Didn't you answer Commissioner Kramer's question about the sewer, that they would still pay the sewer service charge that we all
Correct, but
pay?
it doesn't pay for the upgrades of the facilities that Commissioner Grimm mentioned, and that's a state requirement, so we can't charge that. But we have looked at the sewer system. We did a master plan study just a couple of years ago, and based on our analysis, we believe that this is not going to affect capacity within our system. Mr. Stone wanted to mention the lot coverage issue.
Yes, I'd like to address 2 points. One, I think one of the rationales underlying the thought of waiving some of the impact fees is that the cost of producing an affordable unit tends to be around, $100,000 or so. And so this would be a very affordable way to increase the number of affordable units that goes to the city's RHNA count, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. So although it is a loss, it's a much more affordable means to achieve affordable housing than other types of traditional affordable housing. Secondly, in applying the ordinance for accessory dwelling units, the standards that can be imposed are very limited. So if you have a lot coverage standard that applies to a particular zone, it can be applied to the accessory dwelling unit that's going within that zone. But you cannot apply under state law a separate standard for lot coverage that's particular to accessory dwellings but don't exist outside for normal development within that zone.
So it would involve the entire lot, the
Yes.
primary unit and whatever secondary unit.
And it would apply throughout the entire zone. So it would be a lot coverage for whatever particular zone you're looking at.
Okay, very good. Commissioner Looney.
John, does the city allow,
Don, could you pull your microphone closer to you for me? My ears
This is-
are getting old, so
does the city allow a pre-manufactured unit as an ADU?
Yes. There's no limitations. There used to be design standards, which we removed in 2017 following the state's last amendment.
So when I looked into that, probably 4 or 5 years ago, the city wasn't allowing the pre-manufactured homes even on properties.
We do now.
You do now, okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Hastings.
I wanted to address the concern about, I would call it, who is the developer on the ADU? And part of what I saw in the justification for having these ADUs and more of them and allowing them in all these places is that these are for caregivers, for the old affordable housing ones, family members, people who may not have the kind of funding backing them that general developers do. So, and as I recall at the city council meeting, because I was there for that one, that was sort of their concern as well, that there is something, there can be something a little different about the intent of developing an ADU from developing a multi-family housing apartment building. So that's just to add to the consideration of why we might want to waive the fee, which I am in favor of.
Okay. Very good. Any other comments? Someone like to try and make a motion, or make a motion for us to try and resolve this, or lead us in a direction? Commissioner Bell.
Thank you, Chairman. I move to recommend the... Sorry, what's the phrasing on this? This is why I don't do this.
Recommendation on the first page, approve the ordinance
I move we
amendment.
adopt the recommendation on the first page as stated, but I'm absolutely open to modification if anyone else wants to add.
Commissioner Garrettson?
I would like to add something to that relates to the percentage of the lot that could be covered. And I have no idea what that could be.
If I could clarify real quickly, my staff person over here just informed me that in the R1 zone, there is a lot coverage standard that applies. It's 60%. I apologize. I Didn't realize that was in the R1 zone, but in the E1, A1, and OR zones, there's not a lot coverage standard. That's half acre minimum and larger, but in the 10,000 square foot lot size, there's a 60% lot coverage requirement, meaning they couldn't cover more than 60% of the lot with impermeable surfaces.
So adding an amendment that says 60% maximum would not...
You would have to do that for each zone. So my experience is in the R1 zone where there's 10,000 square foot minimum lot size, the 60% comes into play, and that if you wanted to put an ADU on the property, you'd still have to maintain 40% of your lot. That really does create some space constraints where the ADU has to be appropriately located and you have to have a lot large enough. Once you get into a half acre minimum lot size, it's really not that difficult. If you wanted to include a lot coverage requirement, we could certainly look at that as a zoning amendment separate to the E1 zone. But my experience is it's not really that difficult to meet that standard when you have a half acre lot.
So it probably wouldn't be appropriate to try to include it tonight with this.
We wouldn't be able to tonight. We'd have to revisit it in the zoning categories that you'd want to apply it to, because as Mr. Stone pointed out, it's for the zone, not the ADU.
It would seem to me that that would be a good reason to table this until we had a chance to look at what impact it's going to have on all the zones. I think everybody should, all the residents should know what impact it's going to have on their neighborhood.
Well, if you table it, someone could still build an ADU tomorrow. The only difference is they'd be paying development impact fees and it would be limited in size.
Yeah. Commissioner Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Conley, so the E1, A1, those are half acre plus.
Correct.
So they're governed that the ADU can only be a maximum of 1,200 square feet.
Correct. And has to meet main building setbacks.
So my layman opinion would be the only real concern is the R1 because the lots are smaller. So having a 60% coverage that's already in place, I think it would be okay because all of it is a maximum of 1,200, but you couldn't put 1,200 on an R1 anyways.
I'm going to go ahead and second the motion so we can continue the discussion. Commissioner Grimm.
Yes, this is a real quick question. If you have a situation where you have a over a half acre lot and you're in an HOA that indicates basically, the CC&R is one unit per lot, does the state override that?
Yes.
Really? In an HOA situation? That's interesting. Okay. Thank you.
All right. So we have a motion and a second to approve the amendment as written and proposed by staff. Are we ready for a vote? Okay. Cast your vote, please. And the motion passes on a 5-2 vote with Commissioner Grimm and Commissioner Garrison voting no. Since this is going on to the council as a recommendation, do you want it to include your reasons for opposing the motion? We don't normally do that, but this one is somewhat complicated. Commissioner Grimm.
Like I said, this one's very difficult because, gosh, we really do need affordable housing. For me, it's the fee issue, and then it's a little bit of a. I know there's other bills that are going through the state, or at least been proposed in the state. To me, one of the things that's important in a city is diversity of housing, and to me, this is kind of a devaluation of the single-family zone. So I just worry about the sanctity of the zoning.
Okay. Commissioner Garrison?
The fees are the big thing for me.
Okay.
And I just think that, if you have an acre lot and you have a house that's, 4,000 square feet, I just can't see that as anything but a giveaway to certain individuals.
Okay, very good. So the motion passes on the 5-2 vote, and we can move on to our next item. The next item is a discussion item dealing with the compatibility of residential development in high-density zones with adjacent neighborhoods in lower-density zones, and to provide direction for staff. This is our neighborhood compatibility issue that we've been discussing off and on for the last couple of months. So, Mr. Connolly, your report, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As mentioned, we wanted to cover compatibility of high-density residential with lower-density zones. The primary zones that allow for high-density residential development are the mixed-use zone and the downtown specific plan. These are both zoning designations that allow up to 40 units per acre, up to 60 feet in height in some areas, 4 stories maximum, 3 stories in certain areas. The request from Commissioner Gerritsen several months ago was to look at the transition between these areas and adjacent development and to discuss compatibility. So the staff report focuses on the compatibility with adjacent lower density zoned areas such as the RM zone or any single family zoned areas that allow a maximum height of 2 stories where they butt up against these higher density zones. The staff's focus in discussing this issue was to look at the compatibility between the zones rather than the compatibility between existing structures. So in other words, if you're building a 4-story apartment building next to a 2-story building, but it's in the same mixed-use zone, at the staff level, we typically don't impose the types of step-back requirements that would otherwise apply because the owner of that 2-story building could likewise redevelop his property and build a 4-story structure. So the majority of the policies and how they're implemented look at where are the zoning categories different, not necessarily where are the structures different. That's what's in place today as I'll go through, but I'm happy to take any input from the commission that they'd like to see in the way of existing structures, but from our focus, it's zoning. We also rely a lot on the design guidelines for the review of multifamily development and how it complies with adjacent residential, and so we'll talk about that as well. So with respect to where these areas are located, the mixed-use zone here is shown in the blue. The downtown specific plan is in the purple. As I mentioned, these are all areas that generally allow up to 60-foot height limits with some exceptions in the downtown specific plan, primarily along the north and south Santa Fe corridors and the Vista Village between the 78 up to about Civic Center Drive as well as the Civic Center corridor. There are a couple randomly zoned sites here that you can see off the map that are either near transit centers or were rezoned as part of the general plan update in 2012 based on the property owner's request. So the downtown specific plan is the first one we'll cover. These are all standards that are included in the staff report, so I'm not going to go through them one by one. But the downtown specific plan does have standards that apply for both massing and setbacks of buildings as well as transitional development areas where there's a transition between the types of development. Generally, these guidelines talk about massing and size with relation to neighborhood buildings. There's an exception for civic buildings, which I think was written after we built this place. But really the idea is that we don't overpower smaller structures. There are some different criteria for those buildings facing primary corridors where they're to be step back at the 4th level, or facing secondary streets where they're to be step back at the 3rd level, or for lower development at the same level of where that adjacent development. Projects are to minimize shadow impacts, to reduce impacts on daylight, and rooftop equipment is to be screened so that it doesn't have an impact on adjacent residential areas. Also on the downtown specific plan, there are transitional strategies. There's an exhibit which is included in your staff report that I'll show next, which shows how that transition is supposed to occur. It identifies to provide for step backs in the facade, a minimum of 10 feet at upper floors, which is generally what the staff looks for in the way of reviewing these larger scale buildings. At the 3rd or 4th level, or sometimes at the 2nd level, we want to see a step back so that the building mass isn't one solid face adjacent to a smaller structure, but there's a structural a similarity between the two buildings at the level that they're both at, and then there's a step back at higher levels. These step back areas are supposed to be used for residential open space or common areas like balconies or open patios on the building. A good example of that is 100 Main Street, which we have an example of that I'll show you. Not to be for storage or mechanical, electrical equipment or other components of the building, but that they're actually open areas so that there is space between the lower facade and the upper facade. And again, the mass shall relate in shape and size to adjacent development, which is also included in the prior strategies. So that's with respect to the downtown specific plan. The downtown specific plan does not speak to adjacent zones. It really speaks to adjacent buildings. But we still at the staff level look at it from the perspective of what is adjacent could be developed at a higher level, or is it really so constrained that there's no way that property could ever build a much larger structure, wherein we're looking at a good example of this is 100 Main Street, where it's adjacent to one-story development that is really highly unlikely to ever redevelop. So we look at those on a case-by-case basis. The downtown specific plan includes a transitional diagram, which is shown here on the overhead. It looks at primary corridors and secondary streets in terms of how those step backs are supposed to be looked at. You can see that the commercial or lower level space is generally the largest or most intensive, and then there's step backs as you go up in height. If you get to the third or fourth story, you're even stepping back more on both sides. On the third story, you're stepping back on the street side, but the intent there is that you have some articulation in the structure so that you have breakups at the higher levels so that you don't have this massing, as I said, a straight flat facade that faces lower development. Within the mixed use zone, there are setback requirements that really impose this standard. The setback for those buildings that abut a residential zone is 15 feet for the first 2 stories when you're adjacent to a single-family residential zone, and 25 feet for the third story or higher. So again, a 10-foot step back applies. The step back can be used as balcony space as identified, and the ground surface buffer areas have to be landscaped so that there's direct vehicular access to the property. These assume there's an alley access or a main street access, but again, looking at that setback and requiring that the building provide a step back in the structure so that it's not a mass facing the adjacent residential structure. That's the only requirement in the mixed-use zone. Within the design guidelines, there are additional requirements that apply to multifamily. They're noted here. They're general, but you can see that there's language that promotes the guidance of this. The height, scale, and mass should be similar to that of other buildings in the neighborhood. And at single-family edges, the multifamily building should maintain low profiles to provide a transition, as we're speaking between higher and lower residential areas. The taller element should be increasingly stepped back from adjacent single-family residences to provide an attractive transition and reduce visual appearance of mass. The language in the design guidelines is really guidance. There are requirements in the design guidelines that are more strict and use language like shall and must. We could adjust the language here to make these more forceful, but we do use these at the staff level in terms of reviewing multifamily developments to try to get developers to make them transition better with the adjacent single-family zones. So some examples of some buildings which we've approved and which are coming before you are shown here. On the left is 100 Main Street. On the right is the Terrace Lofts, which is a project that will come before you in a couple of weeks. We did look at this at design review, and so I'm letting the cat out of the bag a little early, but it does kind of show how these architects have used the different components that we've talked about to try to transition their structures from the adjacent. So on the 100 Main Street on the left, you can see the lower level, which is a little shrouded by the landscaping, but it does come out to the street level more. It faces the adjacent one-story developments on the south side of Main Street, and then there's a step back for the higher level structure, and then as you get up to the 4th floor, or the top, I guess it's the 5th floor technically, there's another step back on the top of the structure to try to reduce that massing of that structure with an overhang. That follows, it sort of repeats itself around the building, and in the interior portion, the building's U-shaped, so there's a deck and then a U-shaped building, so there's a large open space in the central portion of the building, again facing Main Street where everything's sort of lower level. As you go across the street to the north, you're going back into the North Santa Fe affordable project, which again is a 3 or 4 story buildings, so that massing is kind of equated as you move north. But the idea is to look at the buildings around it and try to provide that transition between those smaller and larger buildings. The structure on the right is the terrace lofts. Again, you can see the step backs in the 3rd and 4th stories to try to provide some transition for the lower level buildings. And you can see that they actually drew in the existing building there at, I think it's 805 or 508. That's 1 story next door, but the structure you can see has a step back right at that 1st story structure adjacent, and then another step back at the 3rd and 4th levels. So again, our architect in this case tried to provide articulation in the building to address what's around the building and step it back into those higher levels as you get into the central portion of the building. So tonight we're really trying to open the conversation here with the commission. We're seeking direction to see if there are any recommended changes to the zoning requirements or design guidelines related to building compatibility in terms of scale or massing within those transitional areas. We at the staff level believe that there are some good standards in place, but we would like to hear from the commission tonight about what particular issues you'd like us to try to address. And if we can get some guidance from you about things you'd like to see, we can certainly come back with some more defined guidance tonight. My idea was to just try to provide you with a snapshot of what we currently have and use, and to get some feedback from you about what your major concerns are, so at the staff level we can go back and look at what options we may have. We want to make sure you consider the existing zoning allowances. In other words, these zones allow buildings to that scale and height by right. So there are certain setbacks and design requirements, but they can still build a 60-foot high building. We can't tell them they can't unless you want to change the height requirements. So we want to look at what are the kinds of policies that we want to implement to address the shape and form of that building, while not necessarily reducing their ability to meet the densities that are allowed for. And then again, we're focused on the different zoning designations, the transition between single-family or multifamily zones that allow only 2 stories to go up to 4 or 5, rather than existing buildings within that zone that have the same allowances. So that's really it from a staff perspective in terms of what I wanted to present to you, and I'm open to discussing it, and the floor is open to the commission to provide any guidance to staff. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Commissioners, we've dealt with this issue on a number of the multifamily projects that have come before us adjacent to single family, and so what are your concerns, I guess? Commissioner Garrettson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to mention why I wanted to discuss this. And I kind of looked at this as like a triangle. You got the city responsibility to do the right thing by the developer and the right thing by the neighbors. And in that triangle are things like the general plan, zoning, ordinance, CEQA, all the objective things. But I thought we should have a discussion about the objective things like shade. You know, if now I have a view on both sides of my house of the east and west, or the sun setting and the sun rising, and all of a sudden now I got 4 stories because that's part of the zone that was created after I built my house, after I purchased that house. And I looked at the general plan, and there are at least 5 different areas they talk about compatibility. They talk about it in terms of reflect neighborhood characteristics, minimizes impact on adjacent residential development that is of a lower density, protect existing residential neighborhoods, will not have adverse impacts on surrounding properties, businesses, and populations, encourage community participation in planning and development. And I look at the design guidelines, there are at least 12 different areas in the design guidelines that address the idea of compatibility. It may not use the word, but it talks about surrounding areas. So in my opinion, we need to look at those things. Instead of just objective, we should consider subjective kinds of criteria. Now, whether that can override an objective zoning is another thing. But I think if developers know that we're going to look at those things, I think they're going to come before us more prepared to address the needs of the neighborhood. We had one project where the developer never talked to the neighbors, never expressed their concern until they get here. I think if we send that message, that that alone would be a major step. I mean, I know most of them do that, and maybe staff encourages them to do that. But to me, the idea of having this discussion and having people show their subjective concerns and what concerns we've seen from the neighbors in our experience on here, I think should be very healthy. That's why I requested it.
Thank you. Commissioner Bell?
Thank you, Chairman. I think mirroring Commissioner Garrettson's comments, when these projects come before us, I'm always looking for what is my role in asking questions to define the information that's presented to the commission and to the audience, to the public. Answering questions, obviously, but also trying to gather whatever details might help us make a decision and help the public be comfortable with the reason that decision is made. And so on one hand, we have the design guidelines, which are very useful, and especially the examples given in the design guidelines are very useful. And don't do this, but do this. And I think your clarification on what the city offers us in the form of the reports and what the work you do of trying to define the difference between zones, but not necessarily the difference between the buildings that are existing within a zone. So I'm not addressing the specific building, but the picture you're showing has the 508 Tavern next to what's going to be a much larger building. And sometimes I don't know if our role is to protect what might be perceived as the interest of a smaller building next to a larger one within the same zone, or if my role as a commissioner is more to say, accept that the zone allows for this size and shape of building, therefore I'm starting with that level and then trying to fit that to the design guidelines. And there's some happy medium there where anything the city can do, and you guys already do a lot, believe me, this isn't a criticism at all, but anything you can do in your reports and in the information to show the effects that buildings, especially of larger size and shape, will have on the existing neighborhood. Using the same example, you've obviously got this little circle of neighborhood southeast of downtown between Civic Center and Santa Fe and the downtown area that is a different zone than the downtown specific plan and then the mixed use zone. And you certainly feel for the neighbors who have lived on this hillside for a long time that are now seeing Santa Fe change and seeing Civic Center change, whether it's the big building or the one on Civic Center we looked at a couple weeks ago that's just some two-story condos, nothing too high, but certainly a change from what was there before. Anything you can provide that is previous examples in the same neighborhood, I don't know. That's the area I feel a little lost in, is who do I side with when I have a homeowner that comes up and says, please don't build this giant building next to me, and I say, but the zoning allows for it. And so do I default to what the city and the public and everyone went through this very public process years ago to come up with a general plan and come up with these guidelines and standards? I don't want to be mean and say, too bad, you should have been here 7 years ago, but that's I feel like that's the role sometimes. So any guidance you have there is helpful. I don't expect you to have the right answer either.
No, but I want to make sure that the commission understands the position the staff is in.
Yeah.
So when these developers come to our counter, they propose a box, that's 5 stories high and goes to the edge of every setback. And we try to form it into something that we think can get approval from the commission. And yes, we do look at what the impacts are to the adjacent structure and how it's going to affect the buildings around it. But truth be told, if the single-family homeowner that lives on the hill behind it has a view, and that building's going to block their view, well, frankly, that's too bad.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how else to say it, but I mean, if the zoning allows for them to build a 5-story building, we can't tell the developer, you know what, you're going to block this guy's view, and we're not going to allow you to do that because A, we don't have a view protection ordinance, and B, if that homeowner was really concerned about containing or continuing to maintain that view, they have the right to buy that property and keep it open space. I mean, that's the reality of it. So at the staff level, we want to have some guidance and some ability to force the developer to do something that fits as best we can, while not taking away their ability to develop the property at the zone, that's there, and the density that's allowed. So yes, we can force them to make some changes to maybe slightly reduce the density and try to address that impact in terms of putting something that's nice there, or creating a breakthrough in their building or something along those lines to try to address the problem. But in the end, we have very little ability to say you cannot do that because there's nothing in the code that allows us to do it. So we're looking for guidance to help us form it while not restricting the developer's right to build on the property.
And let me just add on, and this will be the end of my section here, maybe a way that could be useful to us. I've seen the benefit of the early design review and how great it is for neighbors and homeowners to come in and see something that is perhaps much bigger than they thought, much broader with a lot more units, and then to come back 3 months, 6 months, 9 months later and see those changes and see the reduction and see the thought that's put into it. So maybe I would say in those circumstances where we're affecting someone's view in a way that is certainly they would see, the homeowner might see as disagreeable or negative, but is the reality and is the law and is the code, perhaps some level of presentation or information, even have the developer encourage them to share it with us of, this is where we started, and your great city staff worked with us for months and months to narrow that down and mold it into something that fit that neighborhood. Because I think oftentimes a homeowner perceives it as the developer came in and dropped this big block, even though there's been a ton of work put into it, but this is the first time they've heard of it when they got the mailer a week ago that's saying there was going to be a new building built. And so anything the city can provide during the presentations or anything that's allowable within the record to show, hey, an early look at this was a lot bigger, because I think it gives people some perspective on how the changes are made. So that's my thought. Thank you.
I have two examples that came to mind while we were discussing this. And this project in the Arts District was one. We had a discussion about the honesty of our density, and using street right-of-way and gross versus net density and determining, and I think the commission had the discussion. The vision for South Santa Fe is 4 stories with ground floor commercial and residential above in a mixed-use environment. So everybody along South Santa Fe has those rights. Now, whether they exercise them or not is up to them. So that's my point of view. And the policy discussion was had. There were public hearings on it, both on the general plan and the downtown specific plan. And so these people have got to pay attention to what's going on in their city, and decide whether they're going to exercise their rights that are allowed under the general plan and zoning. The other one was the Terracina apartments, which I believe are coming back. And we had a single-family neighborhood adjacent to them on the Camino Patricia, off of Camino Patricia. And when we did a review of this area, this commission recommended to the city council, it's a stable single-family neighborhood, and we ought to do some protection with the zoning. And the council, in their wisdom, decided not to follow that advice. And so we have single-family dwellings, a multifamily proposal, and yet the folks in the single family have the same rights to go to as the multifamily proposal. So that's where I think staff's right with the zoning boundary. If there's a zoning boundary, then I've got concerns about compatibility. But if you're within the zone, they've got the same rights. So those are my thoughts. Commissioner Grimm.
Yeah, I think it's real difficult to legislate specifics, in a situation like this where you don't want to stifle creativity and flexibility for the developer. But on the other hand, I spent a lot of time going through the guidelines, and I really think that you have a lot of tools within the guidelines. I mean, even if you just look under your goals and purposes for architecture, it talks about articulated buildings. It talks about a level of detail on all 4 sides. There's a whole bunch of bullet points in there that give you a lot of tools to be able to do that. I think really what it really comes down to is when you implement those goals and those guidelines, is Planning Commission and staff going to back you up? And that's what makes it effective, and that's what makes it work. I think right now, just from the short time I've been on the Planning Commission, they're very supportive, and I think the council is as well. That could change over time, but I really think that in the guidelines, there's a lot of things that you can use to kind of work with the developer to create good projects.
I wanted to just follow up on one thing that Chairman Rossler said, and that is the Terracina project is a great example, and you'll see it again in a couple weeks, but that was a project where the zoning did allow the developer to do certain things, but the Planning Commission was adamant about what they saw that they didn't like. And the ability to table a project and let the developer know, we just don't like that, you need to go back and try to see what you can do with it, is a very powerful thing. And I think you'll see in a couple weeks when that development comes back, they did make some changes to the structure to try to address that issue. And a step back is one of the things that they implemented, which was a big issue with respect to the facade. So it's really important to continue, even within the framework of the zoning, to let applicants know what you don't collectively like and table a project if you have to make them go back and think about it.
Commissioner Looney.
When I first came on the commission, I read through the guidelines, and there's a couple hundred pages to it, but it's well written. And one of the things that we have seen over the last 4, 5, 6 years, which I think is unique, is the willingness of a developer to be flexible. I mean, they really do take to heart what we say here. And just the example that we've got up on the screen, there's been major revisions done to that design. And I've seen that on many, many projects, and so I think the design guidelines have proven to be effective. And at the same time, it gives us enough flexibility to guide the applicant, to guide the development, the developer. And each developer has a different attitude and character and temperament. But for the most part, I have seen a willingness to really respond to our recommendations. I think it works. There will always be the challenges, especially on this project, where I have some friends that live behind this, and it affects their view. But they've always known what the city is going to transition into. And it's one of those things where if you want to buy the land, you can. Again, going back to the development on South Santa Fe and Mar Vista, that was 3 years in the making? And it went from, 192 units down to what it is today. But it works well, and it works well with the community. And so, I think we just need to continue to be diligent and to be attentive and to know the projects as they come before us and to look at it from an educated perspective. And I think it works. I really do.
Good. Commissioner Garrettson.
Thank you. I agree we need to continue to be diligent in looking at the objective criteria which we have to use. I think we would make a huge mistake by not looking at objective perspectives. I'm a big defender of what the city does in terms of the process, in terms of the transparency. And I'm a big supporter of staff and the way they go through it. But I think we need to always look at that objective versus subjective criteria. And, to me, when we get it right is never. That we always look at it that we always look from the developer's perspective, and we always look at it from the neighbor's perspective, and interject what we believe is the right thing to do for the city. And that balance between the developer and the neighbor, I don't know if you're ever going to satisfy everybody, probably not, but I think as long as we're looking at, let's take something like circulation and parking. And it talked about separating pedestrian from vehicles. And it talked about pavers as opposed to just painting. You know, things like that, I think, can make a huge difference. But I think, you know, we got to basically walk a mile in their shoes. I think we got to figure out what kind of guidelines that we can force developers to do in order to comply with concerns and ways to improve it. So that's my objective, is just make sure that we're looking from all perspectives, that if all we have to do is say, yeah, they comply with that, check mark, well, we shouldn't even be here. We shouldn't be here. And I think this discussion hopefully will cause us to be better commissioners and look at the entire picture better, and maybe even have the community know that we care about the community as well, and the developers. And as far as people in a zone saying, well, they could do the same thing. Well, they didn't buy the property there to build a 4-story building. They bought the property there to buy a 1-story home that they wanted to live in. And the city changed the zone to allow for 4 stories. They didn't change. Nothing has changed by that person who has a 1-story building on Smith Street. And now all of a sudden the zone changes and there's 4 stories. They don't want to move. But yet they have certain rights, I think, just because of the fact that they were there. And when they went there, that was the zone, single family. So that's just my perspective.
It's all part of growing pains in a city that's finally being successful. So I think that's why we have public hearings. That's why there are 7 of us up here sitting to add our input to this. I've always thought that we should add value to the projects. You know, that we make decisions and recommendations that make a better vista. So, any other thoughts or comments? Okay, Mr. Connolly, I think that concludes our discussion. Any questions of the commission?
No, I appreciate your input. I think you're right. The design guidelines do have a lot of really good, helpful guidelines in them. I think from the staff perspective, we try to utilize those to the extent we can, and I think we'll make a little bit more of an effort to point out those areas where we think there might be some opportunity with the commission.
Okay, very good. Commissioner Kramer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My thought, and what I think that staff does really well, is, for me personally, when I see the artist one here shown, is it's against that slope. So to me, it easily could take the height. Now, I was a little fearful in the beginning at the artist loft across the street because it's flat. There's no backdrop for a couple of blocks till you get past Quahomie. But the way that you worked with the design group and have those setbacks, it doesn't look invasive. It doesn't look like New York City. So I think that what you're doing and how you are considering the slopes, everything else surrounding the area, it's absolutely beautiful. And nothing is out of place. It's not a New York City. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Thank you. Commissioner Garrettson.
I just want to say that nothing that I've said should reflect negatively on staff. That in the 5 years or so I've been on this, I have never once question integrity, ability, or how supportive they are of this commission. This is a challenge to us to make sure we do our job. I look at all these development, all the guidelines, and you know, if I don't look at them once a week, I'll forget them, and I don't look at them once a week. So staff does that, and they do it over and over again, and I couldn't be more thankful to have the kind of professional staff that we have. This is about us, in my opinion. Thank you.
I would agree. Okay. Any reports or comments from the other commission members? Commissioner Kramer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's single-family homes that are being built on Grapevine, and this had come to us many years ago, way before this commission, and then this commission passed, and the building is proceeding. And I remember there was natural grasses or raptors or something had to be protected. Well, now they've opened it up a little bit, been doing a whole lot of work. If you haven't gone down Grapevine, go look at that darn bridge that they put in there to protect those areas. It is incredible. No houses yet, or some skeleton, but it is beautiful. We done good.
Very good.
Is that the one that goes over to the park? Over?
No, it's all on their same property. It's Grapevine.
Grapevine and Durian Street.
Oh, I know what you mean.
Laurel Creek, I believe, is the name of the project.
Laurel Creek.
Patsy's favorite project.
You did good, Patsy.
All right. Mr. Connolly, your report?
We will have a meeting on June 18th. That's our next meeting. I think we'll give you a little break in July, at least for a few weeks, but there's two projects on the agenda. The Terracina project's coming back, and the Terrace Lofts projects looks like it will get before you for that meeting. And that's all I have.
Okay. Commissioners, let me ask you a question. Everybody going to be here available for June 18th? Okay, yes. I'm not. So Deborah has agreed to chair the meeting graciously, and so I will leave you folks to it. So if there's nothing else, we stand adjourned until June 18th.